The sense of financial exhaustion that so many people feel when looking at their bank accounts isn't an illusion, nor is it a personal failure of budgeting. It is the result of a coordinated, multi-front economic assault that has quietly rewritten the rules of survival over the last several years. When people talk about modern economic struggles, they usually point a finger at inflation as if it is a single, solitary monster hiding under the bed. The reality is far more insidious. What we are living through is an overlapping accumulation of distinct financial structural pressures hitting the average household simultaneously, compounding the damage in a way that makes the math of daily life feel completely broken. To truly understand why your paycheck seems to evaporate before it even hits your account, we have to look past the superficial talking points and decode the actual machinery of the system, connecting the pieces from central bank policies down to your local grocery bill. To kick things off, we need to dismantle the single biggest misunderstanding running rampant in public economic discourse, which is the difference between the rate of inflation slowing down and prices actually dropping. Mainstream financial commentators love to celebrate when the inflation rate ticks down from its terrifying peaks of a couple of years ago, giving the impression that the crisis is resolving. But a lower inflation rate does not mean things are getting cheaper. It just means prices are climbing at a slightly less aggressive sprint than they were before. The higher price baseline established during the peak of the panic is now permanent. For prices to actually return to where they were before the world turned upside down, we would need true economic deflation, which is a prolonged negative inflation rate. Central banks absolutely terrify themselves at the mere thought of deflation because it halts consumer spending and threatens to collapse an economy built on perpetual debt creation. Because the gatekeepers of the economy will do everything in their power to prevent deflation, those inflated prices are here to stay, and the cost of living has effectively shifted to a permanently higher plateau. This permanent price hike wouldn't necessarily be an existential crisis if your income rose at the exact same velocity to match it. If everything costs 30% more but you also make 30% more, the math washes out and your standard of living stays relatively flat. However, the cold data provided by the Federal Reserve reveals a stark and unforgiving gap between reality and that ideal equilibrium. When you look at cumulative wage growth across the board since the dawn of this inflationary cycle, overall wages have climbed by roughly 23%, while consumer prices have surged by at least 28%. That 5% gap might sound small on paper, but in the real world, it represents a massive, silent wealth transfer away from working people. This is especially brutal for part-time workers who face an even more severe lag in compensation. This data is not some partisan hyperbole or doomsday speculation. It is the government's own official math, proving that the average person is fundamentally poorer in terms of actual purchasing power than they were just a few years ago. To make matters worse, even if you are one of the lucky few whose salary miraculously kept pace with that 28% price surge, you are still likely worse off due to the structural trap of the tax code. This phenomenon, often called bracket creep or fiscal drag, is one of the most brilliant and quiet ways the state extracts wealth without having to officially vote for a tax hike. When your nominal income goes up to match the rising cost of goods, your higher salary frequently pushes you into a higher federal or state tax bracket. Suddenly, your effective tax rate climbs, meaning a larger percentage of your total earnings is siphoned off. On top of that, many tax credits, child deductions, and educational write-offs are tied to strict income thresholds. By getting a raise that merely keeps your head above water against inflation, you can easily cross those thresholds and lose your eligibility for those deductions entirely. You end up handing a larger slice of your pie to the government while the slice you keep buys less than it ever did before. When you look closely at where the money is actually going, you find specific sectors experiencing price hikes that completely dwarf the generic, massaged averages reported in the media. Take the insurance industry, which has turned into a massive wealth drain for both homeowners and renters. If you own a home, your insurance premiums have likely skyrocketed over the last few years. Insurance conglomerates justify these hikes by pointing to an increase in payouts from natural disasters, but the underlying driver is the dramatically inflated cost of labor and construction materials required to rebuild a structure today. The U.S. Treasury Department noted that for years, the average insurance premium increased significantly faster than the baseline rate of inflation, and the official tracking of these metrics has become suspiciously opaque lately, likely because the real numbers are a total disaster. Renters are insulated from this either. Landlords and apartment complexes face these exact same compounding insurance spikes, and they immediately pass those added operational costs down to their tenants in the form of higher monthly rent, making property insurance a universal tax on shelter. The transportation sector offers a similarly painful case study in how modern complexity and inflation feed into each other, as seen in the explosion of auto insurance rates. Drivers across the country are opening their renewal notices to find double-digit increases year over year, with average premiums jumping an astonishing 18% in a single 12-month window. This isn't just arbitrary corporate greed, it is a side effect of how cars are manufactured today. Modern vehicles are essentially rolling supercomputers, packed to the brim with sophisticated sensors, cameras, and delicate microchips embedded directly into the bumpers and windshields. What used to be a simple, cheap fender bender that required a little bit of body filler now requires thousands of dollars in high-tech replacement parts and specialized labor to recalibrate complex safety systems. When you mix the inflated cost of raw materials with the sheer technical complexity of fixing a modern car, insurance companies respond by aggressively raising premiums across the board to protect their profit margins. The absolute pinnacle of this compounding stress is the complete implosion of housing affordability. Historically, financial planners use the rule of thumb that housing should consume no more than 30% of your gross income to be considered sustainable. The last time the macroeconomy actually aligned with that metric was around the spring of 2021. Since then, the affordability index has blown past that boundary, with the average household now dedicating well over 40% of its gross income just to keep a roof overhead. If you live in major metropolitan hubs like Cook County, Illinois, this stress is amplified by local property tax assessments that seem to climb without any ceiling, functioning as a compounding penalty on top of record-high home prices. When you stack inflated home values, skyrocketing property taxes, rising utility costs, and bloated rent prices on top of one another, you get an environment where shelter alone devours the wage increases that were supposed to help people cope with the broader inflation crisis. Because human beings still need to eat, transport themselves, and shelter their families regardless of what the central bank says, the massive gap between flat wages and soaring expenses has to be financed somehow. The bridge covering that gap has been a historic, terrifying reliance on high-interest consumer debt. Total credit card debt has marched into unprecedented territory, hitting a record $1.25 trillion, while delinquency rates have quietly scaled to levels we haven't seen since the global financial crisis of 2008. People aren't running up these tabs on luxury vacations and designer goods. They are charging their everyday groceries, utilities, and emergency medical bills just to make it to the next pay cycle. This survival strategy becomes a trap because the average interest rate on credit card debt has hovered around an aggressive 21%. Borrowing money at 21% interest to pay for things that have already inflated by 30% creates a compounding debt vortex that is nearly impossible for an average salary to escape. This debt spiral is mirrored perfectly in the automotive world, where monthly car payments have climbed to heights that would have seemed absurd a decade ago. This isn't an accident, and it leads directly back to the puppet masters of the financial system, the federal government and the Federal Reserve. To respond to various global crises, authorities printed and injected trillions of dollars into the ecosystem, fundamentally degrading the purchasing power of the currency and spiking long-term inflation expectations. When inflation expectations run hot, global investors become highly reluctant to buy long-term U.S. government debt, like treasury bonds and notes, unless they are compensated with much higher yields. To attract buyers and fund its massive deficits, the government has to let those treasury interest rates rise. Because government bonds serve as the fundamental baseline for all global credit, when the interest rate on government debt moves up, the rates on mortgages, car loans, and credit cards are dragged upward right along with it, penalizing ordinary consumers for the fiscal recklessness of the state. The final, daily reminder of this systemic failure is the price of nourishment, where food costs continue to climb with relentless momentum. If you look at long-term food price charts, there was a brief, almost miraculous period around late 2016 where grocery prices actually trended downward for a moment, giving consumers some breathing room. But ever since the post-pandemic monetary expansion, food prices have not only refused to drop, but their upward trajectory has actually accelerated. If you argue with anyone who claims that your complaints about the grocery store are all in your head, the hard data stands firmly on your side. Even worse, many independent analysts argue that the official consumer price index figures for food are heavily massaged through methods like substitution and hedonic adjustments, meaning the real-world pain at the checkout counter is likely far worse than the sanitized percentages the government publishes. Confronting this reality naturally brings up the terrifying question of whether the system is completely doomed and if ordinary people are trapped in a terminal decline. It is easy to slide into pure doom and gloom when looking at these interlocking charts, but understanding the machinery is actually the first step toward reclaiming some agency. The game hasn't become impossible to win, but the difficulty setting has been permanently cranked up. If the economic environment of a decade ago was playing a video game on level 4, we have essentially spawned directly into level 7 without an instruction manual. The old strategies of simply working hard, saving a little cash in a traditional bank account, and hoping for a standard annual raise are completely obsolete in an environment where macro forces are actively depreciating your wealth. Surviving this shifting landscape requires a fundamental upgrade in how we manage capital, negotiate compensation, and understand systemic forces, ensuring that we actively adapt rather than get crushed by an economic ecosystem that has grown remarkably hostile to those who stand still.